When we think of sacrifice, we usually think of animals being slaughtered, blood being displayed, parts of the animals being burned and turned into smoke. We think of blood, fire, and vapor of smoke, violence done to certain animals as a substitute for us. And that's all true. That is an essential part of Old Testament sacrifice. It's an essential part of the fulfillment of Old Testament sacrifice in the bloody, violent death of Jesus. But that's not the fundamental structure of sacrifice. Sacrifice exists as part of the fabric of reality. It's not something that God added after the fall. It's not something that God introduces after Adam and Eve's sin. It's already there in the structure of the world. The clearest example that we see in the early chapters of Genesis is the creation of Eve. God sees that it's not good for man to be alone, and so he decided he's going to make a helper suitable for Adam. But instead of forming Eve from the dust of the ground and breathing into her nostrils the breath of life, he goes through this quite elaborate and somewhat violent surgery, as it were. He puts Adam into deep sleep, a near-death experience. He extracts a rib from Adam's side, and out of that rib he builds a helper suitable for Adam. He builds Eve. That whole process of a near-death experience, and then Adam restored, glorified. That experience of being separated, as the rib being separated from Adam and Eve being separated from Adam in order to be reunited. That whole movement of death and resurrection, that whole movement of death and transfiguration, death and glorification, that is a sacrificial movement. That's what the sacrifices fundamentally are throughout the Bible. And we see it already there before sin is introduced. And once we see it in the creation of Eve, then we can begin to see it in the pattern of creation itself. When God sets about structuring the world, he takes hold of a world that's unified, he tears it in pieces, he puts those pieces into a harmony with each other, he speaks light into existence, he separates light and the darkness, and then he puts light and darkness into this kind of dance of evening and morning that keeps time. He separates the waters above and the waters below, inserting a firmament in between, but then he puts them in a kind of harmony. He separates the waters and the land and then puts those in a kind of harmony. There's a sacrificial pattern all the way through the Genesis 1. Sacrifice is a fundamental reality of the world and not something that's simply imposed. Of course, after sin, new dimensions of sacrifice come to the fore. Already in Genesis 3, we see a couple of these new dimensions. Adam and Eve are given animal skins, the result of the Lord's own sacrifice of animals. He kills animals so they can be covered, and covering of sin and shame becomes an important part of post-lapsarian, post-fall sacrifice. We also see the cherubim at the gate of the garden with their flaming swords that prevent Adam from going back into the garden. That's a sacrificial image. Sacrifice is a gate ritual. It's a way of going into the garden, being returned to the garden, going through the sword and the fire of the cherubim, so that we can again be restored to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. All of these things are already there in the basic theology of sacrifice is already there in the early chapters of Genesis, set up for us and elaborated then in the book of Leviticus and in the Mosaic Law. It's important to see that there's various transformations of sacrifice in the Bible. Not only do we have the original sacrificial patterns of creation, we have the sacrificial patterns of the Mosaic system, but then with David we have introduced a new kind of sacrifice that persists into the new covenant, a sacrifice of praise. And the various, the terminology of sacrifice gets attached to music in the book of Chronicles in particular, and in the book of Psalms. And what ancient Israelites used to do with slaughtering animals and turning them to smoke, we now do by offering our own life's breath in song and praise to God. One conclusion that I often draw from this is that our worship should be as full of the sacrifice of praise as Old Testament worship was full of the sacrifice of animals. Our worship should be as musical as Old Testament worship was sacrificial, because that is the form that Christian sacrifice takes. It takes the form of offering the breath of our bodies, our life's breath in praise to God, a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving and song.